I stood in the boardroom holding a $300 check, my hands trembling with rage as Marcus Bradford's son smirked at me. "This is your real value," he'd said, taking the chief technology officer position I'd earned after single-handedly building the software that saved his father's dying company from bankruptcy. 1 year ago, I was their savior. Today, I was being thrown away like garbage. But as I walked toward that door, I had no idea the next 24 hours would change everything. My name is Astrid, and 18 months earlier, I thought I was walking into the opportunity of a lifetime. Fresh from completing my master's degree at MIT in computer science at age 32, I had spent years climbing the corporate ladder at various tech companies, always hitting glass ceilings that seemed designed specifically for women like me. When Marcus Bradford personally recruited me to join Bradford Technologies as their senior software engineer, I believed I had finally found a place where my skills would be valued. Bradford Technologies was hemorrhaging money faster than a sinking ship takes on water. Their outdated systems were costing them millions annually, and their client retention rate had plummeted to an embarrassing 12%. The company that had once been a leader in business automation software was now struggling to keep the lights on. Marcus Bradford, the founder and CEO, was desperately seeking someone who could diagnose the problems and create solutions before bankruptcy became inevitable. During my first week, I met Harold Winters, the chief financial officer, who had been with the company for over 20 years. Harold was a distinguished man in his late 50s, with silver hair and a warm, grandfatherly demeanor that immediately put me at ease. He wore perfectly tailored suits and had a way of making everyone feel heard and valued during meetings. Harold became my mentor, guiding me through the complex web of company politics and encouraging my most ambitious ideas. "Astrid," he would say during our weekly coffee meetings, "you have the kind of innovative thinking this company desperately needs. Don't let anyone convince you to think smaller." His support felt genuine, and I found myself confiding in him about my frustrations with previous employers and my dreams of making a real impact in the tech industry. Janet Morrison, the head of operations, was another key figure who welcomed me warmly. A sharp woman in her 40s with short auburn hair and an infectious laugh, Janet had worked her way up from an entry-level position and understood the challenges of being a woman in a male-dominated industry. She became both a professional ally and a friend, often inviting me to join her team for lunch or after-work drinks. The third person who would become crucial to my story was Dr. Elizabeth Chen, one of the board members. Elizabeth was in her early 60s with an impressive background in both technology and finance. She had founded 2 successful startups before transitioning into board positions and investment advisory roles. During board meetings, she was the one who asked the most insightful questions about my proposed solutions and seemed genuinely interested in the technical details that made others' eyes glaze over. As I dove into analyzing Bradford Technologies' systems, I quickly realized the scope of the problem was even worse than Marcus had described. Their software architecture was a patchwork of outdated programs held together with digital duct tape. Data flowed inefficiently between departments, creating bottlenecks that slowed every process to a crawl. Customer information was scattered across 7 different databases that rarely communicated with each other. But as I spent late nights digging through financial records and system logs trying to understand where the money was disappearing, I began to notice patterns that didn't make sense. Certain transactions seemed to route through unnecessary intermediary accounts. Payments to vendors were often processed in complex ways that added extra steps and fees. Software licenses were being purchased for programs that appeared to serve no function within our current operations. My breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday evening in November. I had been working alone in the office, cross-referencing financial data with system usage logs, when I discovered a sophisticated embezzlement scheme that had been draining the company for years. Money was being systematically siphoned through fake vendor accounts, inflated licensing fees, and phantom consulting contracts. The amounts were carefully calculated to stay below audit thresholds, but when added together, they totaled millions of dollars. What made my stomach drop was realizing who had the access and knowledge necessary to orchestrate such a complex fraud. Harold Winters, my trusted mentor, was the only person with both the financial authority and system access to execute these transactions. The man who had been encouraging my efforts to save the company was simultaneously destroying it from within. I spent 3 sleepless nights verifying my findings, hoping I was wrong. But every piece of evidence pointed to the same devastating conclusion. Harold had been embezzling from Bradford Technologies for at least 4 years, using his position and reputation to cover his tracks. The company wasn't failing because of market conditions or outdated technology alone. It was being murdered by someone everyone trusted. When I finally worked up the courage to confront Harold, I approached him during one of our regular coffee meetings. My hands shook as I spread the printouts across the table between us, showing him the evidence I had compiled. I expected shock denial, maybe even gratitude that I had uncovered such a serious problem. Instead, Harold's reaction chilled me to the bone. His warm, grandfatherly expression didn't change as he studied the documents. After several long minutes, he looked up at me with the same kind smile he always wore. "Astrid," he said calmly, "this is very serious. If word of this gets out before we handle it properly, it could destroy the company and put everyone's jobs at risk. Give me some time to investigate this quietly and determine the best way forward. We need to be absolutely certain before we make any accusations." His reasonable tone and concern for the company's stability convinced me to trust his judgment. Harold was, after all, the CFO and had far more experience handling sensitive financial matters. I agreed to keep my discoveries confidential while he conducted his own investigation. That decision would turn out to be the biggest mistake of my professional life. For 6 weeks, I waited for Harold to take action on the embezzlement evidence I had provided. During our coffee meetings, he would update me with vague statements about making progress and building a solid case. He assured me that he was coordinating with external auditors and legal counsel to ensure everything was handled properly. His calm confidence kept my growing anxiety at bay. Meanwhile, I poured my energy into completing the software solution that would revolutionize Bradford Technologies' operations. Working 16-hour days, I designed and built an integrated platform that would eliminate the inefficiencies plaguing every department. The software would streamline data flow, automate routine processes, and provide real-time analytics that would give management unprecedented visibility into company operations. My innovation was a comprehensive system I called Bradford Integrated Solutions, or BIS for short. It connected all the company's disparate databases, eliminated redundant processes, and used machine learning algorithms to optimize resource allocation. The software could predict maintenance needs, identify potential client retention risks, and automatically generate detailed financial reports that would make embezzlement virtually impossible to hide. The launch of BIS in February was nothing short of spectacular. Within the first month, the system had identified and eliminated over $2 million in wasteful spending. Client response times improved by 68%. Employee productivity metrics showed dramatic improvements across every department. The software was generating insights that led to new revenue opportunities and cost savings that exceeded even my most optimistic projections. Marcus Bradford was ecstatic. During the company-wide meeting announcing the first quarter results, he praised my work as the innovation that saved Bradford Technologies. Revenue had increased by 43% compared to the previous quarter. Client retention jumped to 89%. Industry publications were requesting interviews about our remarkable turnaround. But despite the celebrations surrounding BIS's success, I noticed subtle changes in how colleagues were treating me. Conversations would stop when I entered rooms. Former allies like Janet Morrison seemed distant and professional rather than friendly. During meetings, people who used to seek my input now avoided eye contact or offered only brief, polite responses to my suggestions. The shift was so gradual that I initially dismissed it as paranoia brought on by stress and long work hours. But as weeks passed, the cold treatment became impossible to ignore. Coffee invitations stopped coming. My ideas in meetings were met with skepticism rather than enthusiasm. Even my direct reports seemed uncomfortable around me. Everything came to a devastating head during a private meeting with Marcus Bradford in late March. I had requested the meeting to discuss potential improvements to BIS and to finally address Harold's lack of progress on the embezzlement investigation. Instead, Marcus blindsided me with accusations that shattered my world. "Astrid," Marcus said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I've been made aware of some very serious concerns about your conduct here. Harold has brought me evidence suggesting that you've been embezzling money from the company and using your software position to cover your tracks." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at Marcus in complete shock, unable to process what I was hearing. "That's impossible," I stammered. "Marcus, I'm the one who discovered the embezzlement. I brought the evidence to Harold 6 weeks ago." Marcus's expression was stone-cold serious as he opened a folder on his desk. "Harold showed me transaction logs that indicate suspicious transfers coinciding with your system access. The amounts match discrepancies that our auditors have been investigating. Your own software is being used as evidence of your ability to manipulate financial records without detection." My heart pounded as I realized what had happened. Harold had used the 6 weeks I had given him to fabricate evidence against me. He had taken my own discoveries about his embezzlement scheme and twisted them to make me appear guilty. The very software I had created to save the company was being used as proof of my supposed crimes. "Marcus, you have to listen to me," I pleaded. "Harold is the one stealing from the company. I have documentation proving his involvement in the embezzlement. He's manipulating you." But Marcus's 20-year friendship with Harold carried more weight than my 18 months at the company. Harold had carefully poisoned Marcus's perception of me while maintaining his own image as a loyal, trusted advisor. Every piece of evidence I presented was dismissed as potential fabrication or misdirection. The meeting ended with Marcus placing me on administrative leave pending a full investigation. As I cleaned out my desk that evening, I felt the crushing weight of betrayal and helplessness. My mentor had not only stolen from the company, but had successfully turned my greatest professional achievement into evidence of my supposed guilt. Harold Winters had played me perfectly, and I had handed him every tool he needed to destroy me. During my forced administrative leave, I couldn't sit idle while my reputation was being systematically destroyed. I spent my days conducting my own investigation, determined to uncover the truth and clear my name. What I discovered was far more sinister than simple embezzlement. Using my remaining system access before it was revoked, I dug deeper into company records and uncovered a web of deception that extended beyond Harold's financial crimes. Tyler Bradford Marcus's 28-year-old son was not the incompetent nepotism hire I had initially assumed. He was an active participant in a carefully orchestrated conspiracy. Tyler had accumulated massive gambling debts totaling over $400,000. His creditors included some very dangerous people who were not known for their patience with delinquent accounts. Desperate for money and legitimacy within his father's company, Tyler had approached Harold with a proposition that would solve both their problems. I discovered encrypted email exchanges between Tyler and Harold, dating back 8 months long before I was even hired. The emails revealed a plan that was breathtaking in its audacity and cruelty. Harold would continue his embezzlement while simultaneously positioning Tyler as the company's technological savior. When the time was right, they would frame me for Harold's crimes and present Tyler as the brilliant innovator who could fix the company's problems. The plan required Tyler to appear incompetent while secretly feeding Harold detailed information about my work progress. Tyler had been attending my project meetings, asking seemingly innocent questions and reporting back to Harold about every breakthrough and challenge. This intelligence allowed Harold to stay one step ahead of my investigation and prepare his counter-moves. Harold had promised Tyler that once I was discredited and removed, Tyler would receive credit for creating BIS. Harold would provide technical documentation and financial projections that would make Tyler appear to be a technological genius. With his father's support and the success of his software innovation, Tyler would be positioned as the heir apparent to lead Bradford Technologies. The sophisticated nature of their collaboration became clear as I uncovered more evidence. Tyler had been carefully coached on technical terminology and basic programming concepts so he could discuss the software convincingly. Harold had created fake project timelines and development notes that supported Tyler's false claims of involvement in BIS's creation. Most damaging was the discovery that Tyler and Harold had been planning my removal for months before the embezzlement evidence surfaced. They had anticipated that someone with my skills might eventually uncover Harold's financial crimes. Rather than stopping the embezzlement, they decided it was safer to eliminate the threat I represented. The anniversary celebration that was supposed to honor BIS's success had been planned as my public humiliation. Tyler would be announced as the new chief technology officer, taking credit for the software that had saved the company. Harold would present fabricated evidence of my supposed crimes to justify my termination. The $300 severance check was calculated as the maximum insult they could deliver while staying within legal requirements. What made the conspiracy even more cruel was discovering how they had manipulated my relationships with other employees. Harold had spent months spreading subtle poison about my character, suggesting that I was difficult to work with and prone to taking credit for team achievements. He had convinced several key employees that I was arrogant and dismissive of their contributions to company success. Janet Morrison, who I had considered a close friend, had been told that I had privately criticized her management skills and questioned her competence. Harold had fabricated quotes and taken my comments out of context to paint me as a toxic colleague who looked down on others. The gradual shift in how people treated me wasn't paranoia. It was the result of Harold's systematic campaign to isolate me professionally and personally. As I pieced together the full scope of their betrayal, I felt a rage unlike anything I had ever experienced. These men hadn't just stolen money or even just stolen credit for my work. They had stolen my relationships, my reputation, and my sense of security in the world. They had turned my greatest professional triumph into a weapon against me. But understanding the depth of their conspiracy also gave me something I desperately needed: clarity about what I was truly fighting against. This wasn't just about clearing my name or getting my job back. This was about exposing a level of corporate betrayal that destroyed lives and threatened the livelihoods of every honest employee at Bradford Technologies. I knew I couldn't fight this battle alone, but I had no idea where to find an ally who would believe my story over the carefully constructed lies Harold and Tyler had spread. The anniversary celebration of BIS's launch was held on a crisp Friday morning in February at the downtown Marriott Hotel. The event was supposed to commemorate the software that had transformed Bradford Technologies from a failing company into an industry success story. Revenue had grown by over 150% since BIS's implementation. The company had won 3 major industry awards for innovation and operational excellence. Trade publications were hailing Bradford Technologies as a model for corporate reinvention. I attended the event under the assumption that my administrative leave was temporary and that the investigation would eventually clear my name. Harold had even called me personally to encourage my attendance, suggesting that the celebration would provide an opportunity to put recent difficulties behind us and move forward constructively. The ballroom was decorated with banners featuring BIS performance statistics and testimonials from satisfied clients. A large screen displayed real-time analytics from the software, showing the impressive metrics that had become standard since the system's implementation. Employees mingled with clients, board members, and industry journalists who had come to cover Bradford Technologies' remarkable turnaround story. Marcus Bradford opened the celebration with a speech about the company's transformation and bright future. He spoke eloquently about the importance of innovation and the value of having visionary leaders who could guide organizations through challenging times. As he spoke, I noticed Tyler Bradford standing near the front of the room, wearing an expensive navy suit and projecting an air of confident leadership that I had never seen from him before. When Marcus announced that he had a special presentation to make, I assumed it would be recognition for the entire development team, or perhaps a broader acknowledgement of company-wide efforts. Instead, my world collapsed as Marcus invited Tyler to join him on stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced with obvious pride, "I'm thrilled to announce the promotion of Tyler Bradford to Chief Technology Officer of Bradford Technologies. Tyler has been the driving force behind our revolutionary BIS software platform, and his innovative leadership will guide our technology initiatives into the future." The applause that filled the room felt like thunder crashing directly over my head. I watched in stunned disbelief as Tyler stepped forward to accept congratulations and praise for work that had consumed 18 months of my life. The software that represented my greatest professional achievement was being attributed to someone who barely understood how to operate it. Tyler's acceptance speech was a masterpiece of fabricated modesty and stolen insights. He spoke about the collaborative process that led to BIS's development using technical terminology that Harold had obviously coached him to memorize. He discussed future enhancements and strategic directions that came directly from my own project documentation and planning notes. "Innovation isn't about individual brilliance," Tyler said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "It's about understanding systems, anticipating needs, and creating solutions that truly serve our clients and our team. BIS represents not just a software platform, but a new way of thinking about how technology can transform business operations." Every word was stolen from presentations I had given to the board and strategic planning documents I had written. Tyler was delivering my vision for the company's future, while I stood powerless in the audience watching my professional identity being erased in real time. After the formal presentations concluded, the celebration continued with networking and informal conversations. I found myself increasingly isolated as colleagues who had once valued my input now treated me like a stranger. Former teammates offered polite but distant greetings before quickly moving on to other conversations. Clients who had previously sought my expertise now directed their technical questions to Tyler. The final humiliation came as the event was winding down. Tyler approached me near the exit, flanked by Harold and 2 other executives. His expression was no longer the modest, uncertain demeanor I was accustomed to seeing. Instead, he wore a smirk of absolute victory. "Astrid," Tyler said loudly enough for nearby colleagues to hear, "I wanted to personally thank you for your contributions during your time here. While your employment is being terminated due to the serious concerns that have been raised, we recognize that you did provide some assistance during the development process." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew an envelope, extending it toward me with theatrical formality. "This severance payment reflects your actual value to the company," he continued, his voice dripping with condescension. $300 should be more than adequate compensation for your level of contribution." The envelope felt impossibly light in my hands as I stared at the check inside. $300. After 18 months of dedication, innovation, and achievement that had saved the company from bankruptcy, they were dismissing me with the equivalent of a weekend's spending money. "This is your real value," Tyler repeated, his voice carrying clearly across the ballroom. "I hope you'll find it educational to understand how the business world actually operates." The conversations around us had stopped. Dozens of colleagues, clients, and industry professionals were witnessing my public humiliation. I could see pity and embarrassment in some faces, while others showed the cold satisfaction of people watching someone they had been told was problematic finally getting their comeuppance. Standing there with that pathetic check in my hands, surrounded by people who believed I was a fraud and a thief, I felt a rage so pure and focused that it burned away every trace of self-doubt and confusion. These men had not just stolen my work or my job. They had orchestrated a public execution of my professional reputation in front of everyone who mattered in my industry. I looked Tyler directly in the eyes and spoke in a voice that was steady despite the fury consuming me. "You're absolutely right that this will be educational," I said. "I'm going to learn exactly what justice looks like." Without another word, I walked toward the exit, my head held high despite the whispers and stares following my departure. I had no plan and no allies, but I had something more powerful than both absolute certainty that I would find a way to make them pay for what they had done. As I stepped into the cool February air outside the hotel, I had no idea that salvation was already looking for me. 3 days after the humiliation at the anniversary celebration, I was sitting in a small coffee shop 6 blocks from my apartment, staring at my laptop screen and trying to figure out how to rebuild a career that had been systematically destroyed. My savings account would last about 4 months if I lived frugally. My professional references were poisoned by Harold's manipulation campaign. The tech industry in our city was small enough that news of my disgrace had already spread to other companies. I was researching job opportunities in other states when I noticed someone approaching my table. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the board member who had always asked insightful questions during my presentations, stood beside me with a coffee cup in her hand and concern in her eyes. "Astrid," she said quietly, "may I join you?" I nodded, too surprised to speak. Elizabeth settled into the chair across from me and studied my face with the kind of intensity I remembered from board meetings. "I want you to know that I never believed the accusations against you," she said without preamble. "Your work on BIS was extraordinary, and your character during presentations was consistently professional and competent. The story they're telling about your supposed misconduct doesn't align with anything I observed during your time at the company." Her words hit me like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in deep water. After days of isolation and self-doubt, having someone of Elizabeth's stature validate my competence felt like the first ray of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice thick with emotion I hadn't realized I was holding back. "But I don't know how to prove what really happened. Harold has covered his tracks too well, and everyone believes his version of events." Elizabeth leaned forward, her expression becoming more intense. "That's why I wanted to find you. I've been conducting my own investigation into the financial irregularities at Bradford Technologies. Before joining the board, I spent 15 years as a forensic accountant specializing in corporate fraud detection. The patterns I've been seeing in our financial reports don't match Harold's explanations, and I've been looking for someone with technical expertise who could help me understand the digital components of what I suspect is happening." She opened a slim briefcase and withdrew a folder containing financial documents and spreadsheets covered with her handwritten notes. I've identified discrepancies totaling over $3.7 million across the past 4 years. The money is disappearing through vendor payments, consulting contracts, and software licensing fees that don't correspond to any legitimate business purposes. The transactions are sophisticated enough to avoid triggering standard audit protocols, but they follow patterns that suggest systematic embezzlement. As Elizabeth spread the documents across our small table, I recognized many of the same irregularities I had discovered months earlier. But her analysis was far more comprehensive than my initial investigation. She had identified additional layers of the fraud scheme that I had missed, including connections to shell companies and offshore accounts that Harold had established to launder the stolen money. The most damaging aspect, Elizabeth continued, is that Harold has been using his position to manipulate board discussions about your performance. He's been feeding us information that painted you as difficult to work with and potentially dishonest. When the embezzlement allegations surfaced, he had already primed us to believe you were capable of such misconduct. Learning that Harold's manipulation had extended to the board level was devastating, but not surprising. He had spent months preparing for the moment when he would need to deflect suspicion away from himself. By poisoning my reputation in advance, he had ensured that his accusations would be accepted without serious scrutiny. "I need your help," Elizabeth said, her voice taking on an urgent tone. "I understand the financial components of what Harold has been doing, but I need someone who can trace the digital evidence and understand how your software might have been used to facilitate or conceal the fraud. Together, we might be able to build a case strong enough to expose the truth." The proposal felt like a miracle, but I was cautious about trusting anyone after Harold's betrayal. "Why are you willing to risk your reputation to help me?" I asked. "You're a respected board member with nothing to gain from getting involved in this controversy." Elizabeth's expression became fierce with determination. "Because I've seen what happens when good people stay silent about corporate fraud. Earlier in my career, I failed to speak up about irregularities I noticed at a company where I worked. The embezzlement continued for 2 more years and eventually destroyed the retirement savings of over 300 employees. I swore I would never again allow my fear or caution to enable such devastating theft." She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. "More importantly, I recognize talent and integrity when I see it. Your work on BIS was genuinely revolutionary, and the way you've conducted yourself throughout this crisis has shown remarkable grace under pressure. If we can expose Harold's crimes and clear your name, we might be able to prevent Tyler from continuing this fraud and protect the jobs of everyone at Bradford Technologies." As we sat in that small coffee shop surrounded by the quiet conversations of other customers and the gentle hum of espresso machines, Elizabeth and I formed an alliance that would change everything. Her expertise in forensic accounting combined with my technical knowledge of Bradford Technologies systems created a powerful investigative partnership. We spent the next 4 hours planning our approach. Elizabeth had already compiled extensive financial evidence, but we needed digital proof that would conclusively demonstrate Harold's involvement in the embezzlement scheme. My insider knowledge of the company's software architecture would allow us to trace transaction flows and identify the technical methods Harold had used to steal money and cover his tracks. The investigation would be dangerous. Harold had demonstrated his willingness to destroy lives to protect his secrets. If he discovered what we were doing, he would certainly try to discredit Elizabeth just as he had me. But we both understood that exposing the truth was worth any personal risk. As Elizabeth prepared to leave, she turned back to me with a slight smile. "There's one more thing you should know. I've been documenting Harold's behavior and statements during board meetings for the past 6 months. If he's been lying about the embezzlement and manipulating evidence, there will be inconsistencies between his private statements to the board and the story he's telling publicly. That evening, for the first time since the anniversary celebration, I felt something resembling hope. I wasn't alone anymore, and I had found an ally with both the expertise and the moral courage to fight for justice. Harold and Tyler thought they had won, but they had made a critical miscalculation. They had underestimated the power of truth when it's supported by competent, determined allies. Over the next 6 weeks, Elizabeth and I conducted the most thorough corporate fraud investigation I had ever witnessed. Working from my apartment and meeting discreetly in different locations around the city, we assembled a case that would expose not just Harold's embezzlement, but the full scope of his conspiracy with Tyler Bradford. My deep knowledge of Bradford Technologies' software systems proved invaluable in tracing the digital evidence of Harold's crimes. Using backdoor access codes I had built into BIS for system maintenance, I was able to track transaction flows and identify the sophisticated methods Harold had used to steal money over 4 years. The embezzlement scheme was far more complex than I had initially discovered. Harold had created a network of 18 shell companies, each with legitimate-sounding names like Advanced Business Solutions and Strategic Technology Consulting. These fake entities submitted invoices for services that were never provided, software licenses that were never delivered, and consulting fees for advice that was never given. But our most shocking discovery came when we analyzed the timing and amounts of Harold's thefts in relation to Tyler's gambling activities. Elizabeth's forensic accounting skills revealed that Harold's embezzlement had increased dramatically 8 months earlier, coinciding exactly with Tyler's mounting debts and pressure from creditors. The two men weren't just collaborating to frame me and steal credit for BIS. They were planning something far more sinister: the intentional destruction and acquisition of Bradford Technologies itself. Hidden within Harold's financial records, we found evidence of secret negotiations with 3 competing companies interested in acquiring Bradford Technologies' assets. Harold had been providing these competitors with confidential information about company operations, client contracts, and technological capabilities. The goal was to drive down the company's valuation through strategic sabotage, allowing Harold and Tyler to orchestrate a buyout at a fraction of the company's true worth. My revolutionary BIS software was the crown jewel they intended to steal. With Tyler positioned as the supposed creator of the technology and Harold controlling the financial details of any acquisition, they could sell the company to competitors and walk away with tens of millions of dollars while destroying the livelihoods of every honest employee. Tyler's gambling debts hadn't been the desperate mistake of a spoiled rich kid. They had been carefully manufactured to create a paper trail that would explain large cash movements and provide cover for money laundering operations. The dangerous creditors threatening Tyler were actually business associates who were part of the acquisition conspiracy. The 3-year timeline Elizabeth had uncovered showed meticulous planning that began long before I was hired. Harold had been systematically weakening Bradford Technologies while secretly negotiating with competitors who wanted to acquire the company's client base and technological assets. My hiring and the development of BIS had provided an unexpected opportunity to steal genuinely valuable intellectual property along with the company itself. Every element of my professional destruction had been calculated to serve their larger scheme. By framing me for embezzlement, they removed the one person capable of exposing their crimes while positioning Tyler as the technological genius who could lead the company through acquisition negotiations. Harold's reputation as a trusted CFO would make him the natural choice to handle the financial details of any buyout. As we compiled our evidence, Elizabeth and I realized we were racing against time. Harold's communications with competing companies suggested that acquisition discussions were accelerating. Once a sale was completed, any evidence of fraud would become much harder to pursue legally, and the destruction of Bradford Technologies would be irreversible. Our investigation required careful coordination to avoid detection. Elizabeth used her board access to gather internal documents and financial records, while I focused on technical evidence that could only be obtained through system access. We created encrypted communication channels and met in different locations each time to discuss our findings. The breakthrough that gave us confidence to move forward came when I discovered Harold's backup communication system. In addition to his official company email account, Harold had been using a personal encrypted email service to coordinate with Tyler and their outside associates. By analyzing network traffic patterns through BIS's monitoring capabilities, I was able to identify the digital signatures of Harold's secret communications. Working with Elizabeth's contacts in the cybersecurity community, we obtained legal authorization to access Harold's encrypted emails through a court order that Elizabeth had quietly pursued. The email records provided smoking gun evidence of the conspiracy, including detailed discussions of framing me, plans for company acquisition, and instructions for Tyler's public presentation at the anniversary celebration. Perhaps most damning was an email exchange where Harold and Tyler discussed the poetic justice of using my own software to steal the company I had saved. They had laughed about the irony of my technical skills being turned against me and speculated about my reaction when I discovered the full scope of their betrayal. With comprehensive evidence assembled, Elizabeth and I began planning our counterattack. Simply presenting our findings to Marcus Bradford wouldn't be sufficient. Harold's influence over Marcus was too strong, and Tyler's family relationship provided additional protection against accusations. We needed a revelation dramatic enough to cut through years of manipulation and force immediate action. Elizabeth's solution was brilliant in its directness. She would call an emergency board meeting to address urgent financial irregularities that required immediate investigation. The meeting would be attended by all board members Marcus Bradford and representatives from the FBI's white-collar crime division, who Elizabeth had contacted through her professional network in forensic accounting. The FBI agents were particularly interested in our case because Harold's scheme involved interstate wire fraud money laundering through offshore accounts and conspiracy charges that could result in significant federal prison sentences. They had been building their own parallel investigation based on suspicious transaction reports filed by banks involved in Harold's shell company operations. On the morning of the board meeting, as I prepared to present evidence that would vindicate my reputation and expose the truth about Bradford Technologies, I felt a combination of nervousness and anticipation unlike anything I had experienced. Harold and Tyler believed they had destroyed me completely. They had no idea that their victims had spent weeks building the case that would bring them to justice. Justice was finally within reach, and it would be more comprehensive than I had ever dared to hope. The emergency board meeting convened at 9 a.m. on a gray Tuesday morning in the Bradford Technologies conference room. Elizabeth had arranged the meeting under the pretense of addressing critical financial discrepancies that required immediate board attention. Marcus Bradford looked confused and slightly annoyed as he took his seat at the head of the conference table, clearly wondering why Elizabeth had insisted on such urgency. Harold Winters entered the room with his usual confident demeanor, carrying his leather portfolio and wearing the same reassuring smile that had fooled everyone for years. Tyler Bradford followed his father into the room, looking slightly uncomfortable, but maintaining the arrogant posture he had adopted since his promotion to Chief Technology Officer. What neither Harold nor Tyler noticed were the two additional men in dark suits who had quietly taken seats at the far end of the table. Special Agent David Park and Agent Sarah Williams from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division had been coordinating with Elizabeth for 2 weeks, building their own federal case based on the evidence we had compiled. Elizabeth called the meeting to order and began with a statement that immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. We are here today to address systematic embezzlement and corporate fraud that has been occurring at Bradford Technologies for the past 4 years. The evidence we have uncovered reveals a conspiracy involving theft of over $4 million, manipulation of company operations, and plans to fraudulently acquire this company through intentional sabotage. Marcus Bradford's face went pale as Elizabeth began presenting financial documents that clearly showed Harold's embezzlement scheme. Charts and spreadsheets displayed the flow of money through fake vendor accounts, inflated consulting contracts, and shell companies that existed solely to funnel stolen funds into Harold's personal accounts. Harold maintained his composure during the first few minutes of Elizabeth's presentation, occasionally interjecting with questions about data sources and suggesting that there might be innocent explanations for the discrepancies. But his confident facade began cracking as Elizabeth revealed the depth and sophistication of her investigation. The moment that shattered Harold's composure completely was when I entered the conference room carrying a laptop computer and a stack of printed email records. Harold's eyes widened with genuine shock as he realized that his carefully constructed web of lies was about to collapse entirely. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to reveal, "I want to share with you the digital evidence that exposes not just embezzlement, but a conspiracy to destroy this company and steal the intellectual property that saved it from bankruptcy." Using the conference room's projection system, I displayed Harold's encrypted email communications with Tyler and their outside associates. The emails contained detailed discussions of their plan to frame me for Harold's crimes, position Tyler as the creator of BIS software, and manipulate company valuation to enable a fraudulent acquisition. The room fell completely silent as I read selected excerpts from emails where Harold and Tyler discussed the perfect timing of destroying my reputation during the anniversary celebration and their excitement about finally getting rid of the problem I represented to their scheme. Tyler Bradford's arrogant composure evaporated as the evidence mounted. His face flushed red with panic as he realized that his father was hearing recorded evidence of his participation in conspiracy and fraud. Marcus Bradford's expression shifted from confusion to horror to a rage I had never seen from the typically controlled CEO. The most devastating evidence came when I displayed transaction records showing how Harold had used his CFO access to steal money that had been earmarked for employee bonuses, retirement fund contributions, and expansion projects that would have created dozens of new jobs. Harold hadn't just stolen from the company. He had stolen directly from his colleagues and their families. Agent Park stepped forward to address the room as I concluded my presentation. "Harold Winters and Tyler Bradford, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and embezzlement of funds in excess of $4 million. You have the right to remain silent." The arrest was swift and professional. Harold maintained his dignity as handcuffs were applied, but his face showed the devastation of a man watching his carefully constructed life collapse in real time. Tyler broke down completely, sobbing and pleading with his father to somehow make the situation go away. Marcus Bradford sat in stunned silence as federal agents led his son and most trusted advisor out of the conference room. The man who had built Bradford Technologies from nothing was confronting the reality that his company had been systematically betrayed by the two people he trusted most in the world. After the arrests, Elizabeth and I spent 3 hours with Marcus and the remaining board members explaining the full scope of what had been happening and outlining steps needed to prevent further damage to the company. The FBI would be freezing Harold's assets and working to recover as much stolen money as possible, but the immediate priority was stabilizing operations and restoring confidence among employees and clients. Marcus's apology to me was heartfelt, but almost unnecessary. The evidence spoke so clearly that no personal vindication was required. "Astrid," he said, his voice heavy with regret and exhaustion, I failed you in the worst possible way. My inability to see Harold's manipulation nearly destroyed everything you worked to build here. The board's unanimous decision was to offer me the position of Chief Executive Officer with full authority to lead Bradford Technologies through the recovery process and beyond. The offer was generous and represented complete vindication of my abilities and character. But during the weeks I had spent investigating Harold's crimes and planning our counterattack, I had discovered something unexpected about myself. The experience of being betrayed and fighting back had clarified my own values and ambitions in ways that years of corporate success had never achieved. I declined the CEO position, but negotiated terms that would benefit everyone involved. I would serve as a consultant for 6 months, helping to stabilize operations and rebuild the company culture that Harold's manipulation had poisoned. During that time, I would also be launching my own technology consulting firm specializing in corporate security software and fraud prevention systems. Marcus agreed to become the first major investor in my new company, providing both funding and a public endorsement that would establish credibility in the market. Several of Bradford Technologies' most talented employees, including Janet Morrison, chose to join my firm when their consulting contracts expired. The trial of Harold Winters and Tyler Bradford concluded 8 months later with convictions on all federal charges. Harold was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution of $4.3 million. Tyler received 6 years and was required to complete community service focused on financial literacy education for young adults. 1 year after that devastating anniversary celebration, I stood in the modern offices of Chen Anderson Cybersecurity Solutions, the company Elizabeth and I had founded together. Our client list included Fortune 500 companies seeking the kind of comprehensive fraud protection that could have prevented Harold's crimes. My software innovations were being used by organizations across the country to detect and prevent corporate embezzlement. The name Chen Anderson honored both Elizabeth's courage in standing up for truth and my own journey from victim to advocate. Elizabeth had left her board positions to become our chief operating officer, bringing decades of expertise in forensic accounting and corporate governance to our rapidly growing firm. Bradford Technologies had not only survived the scandal, but had thrived under new leadership that prioritized transparency and ethical operations. Marcus Bradford had implemented governance reforms that made fraud virtually impossible and had established an employee profit-sharing program funded by the recovered stolen money. Janet Morrison, who became our Director of Client Relations, often reflected on how Harold's manipulation had nearly destroyed relationships that were actually built on mutual respect and shared values. The most insidious part of what Harold did, she told me during one of our monthly strategy meetings, was making us doubt our own judgment about people we knew to be good and competent. As I reflect on everything that happened, I've learned that betrayal, while devastating, can also be transformative when it forces you to discover reserves of strength and determination you didn't know you possessed. Harold and Tyler believed that destroying my reputation would eliminate the threat I represented to their scheme. Instead, their betrayal motivated me to build something far more significant than they ever could have stolen. The $300 check that Tyler handed me during my public humiliation now hangs framed in our conference room. Not as a reminder of pain, but as a symbol of how drastically wrong people can be when they underestimate the power of truth and the determination of people who refuse to accept injustice. My story proves that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can become the catalyst for the best thing you'll ever build. Corporate fraud destroys lives and dreams, but it cannot destroy the human capacity to fight back, to seek justice, and to create something better from the wreckage of betrayal. Today, Chen Anderson Cybersecurity Solutions employs 47 people who wake up every morning knowing their work protects honest employees from the kind of betrayal I experienced. That knowledge gives meaning to every challenge we faced and every victory we achieved. The biggest mistake Harold and Tyler made wasn't underestimating my technical skills or Elizabeth's investigative abilities. Their biggest mistake was believing that good people would stay down after being knocked down rather than getting up stronger and more determined than ever. What would you do if you discovered that someone you trusted was systematically destroying everything you had worked to build? Have you ever had to choose between staying silent about wrongdoing or risking everything to fight for what's right? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might benefit from hearing about the power of perseverance and the importance of standing up to corporate fraud. Your support helps these stories reach people who need to know that justice is possible, even when the odds seem impossible. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about real people who refused to accept injustice and found the courage to fight back against betrayal and corruption. Thank you for listening, and remember that your integrity and determination are more powerful than any conspiracy designed to destroy them.